Judge Rachel Martinez had seen it all in her 15 years on the bench. Drug dealers, thieves, violent criminals, they all blended together after a while. Tuesday morning started like any other day in her courtroom in downtown Phoenix. She adjusted her black robe, took a sip of her coffee, and looked at the case file in front of her. The defendant's name was listed as Anthony Rivera. Armed robbery, third offense. She skimmed through the details without much interest. Another repeat offender who would probably get the maximum sentence under the three strikes law. She had handled hundreds of these cases before, but when the bailiff brought the defendant into the courtroom, Rachel's coffee cup nearly slipped from her hands. The man standing before her looked nothing like the person she remembered, but those eyes, those dark brown eyes, were unmistakable. Her heart started pounding as memories came flooding back. This was Tony, her best friend from childhood. The boy who had lived 3 houses down from her on Maple Street. The kid who had shared his peanut butter sandwiches with her when her mom forgot to pack lunch. The teenager who had walked her to school every morning for 4 years. Rachel tried to keep her face neutral, but inside she was reeling. Tony looked so different now. His face was thin and weathered, with deep lines around his eyes that made him look much older than his 42 years. His hair, once thick and black, was now streaked with gray and cut short. He wore an orange jumpsuit that was too big for his frame, and his hands were cuffed in front of him. She watched as he shuffled to the defendant's table, his head down. He hadn't noticed her yet. Or maybe he had and was pretending not to recognize her. Rachel couldn't tell. Her mind raced back to their childhood in the working-class neighborhood where they had grown up. Tony had been the kind of kid who would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. When Rachel's family was going through tough times and couldn't afford school supplies, Tony would somehow always have an extra pencil or notebook to share. He never made her feel bad about it either. She remembered the day Tony's dad lost his job at the factory. Tony was only 14, but he started working odd jobs around the neighborhood to help his family pay bills. He would mow lawns, deliver newspapers, and help elderly neighbors with their groceries. Despite all the pressure at home, he never missed a day of walking Rachel to school. Tony had big dreams back then. He wanted to be a teacher, just like Mr. Henderson, their favorite English teacher who had encouraged both of them to read and write. Tony would talk for hours about how he wanted to help kids from neighborhoods like theirs. He believed education was the way out of poverty, and he wanted to be the person who showed other kids that path. Rachel had her own dreams of becoming a lawyer. She and Tony would sit on her front porch during summer evenings, talking about their future plans. They promised each other they would both make it out of the neighborhood and do something meaningful with their lives. They were going to prove that where you came from didn't determine where you ended up, but life had a way of taking unexpected turns. The last time Rachel had seen Tony was at their high school graduation. They had both gotten scholarships, Rachel to the State University for pre-law, and Tony to the community college for education. They hugged goodbye that day, promising to stay in touch. But college was demanding, and slowly they lost contact. Rachel heard through mutual friends that Tony had dropped out of college after his first year when his mother got sick. After that, she lost track of him completely. Now, 30 years later, here he was in her courtroom as a criminal defendant. Rachel forced herself to focus on the present moment. The prosecutor was reading the charges against Tony. Armed robbery at a convenience store. He had allegedly threatened the clerk with what appeared to be a weapon and demanded money from the cash register. It was his third felony conviction, which meant he was facing life in prison under California's 3 strikes law. As the prosecutor spoke, Rachel found herself studying Tony's face. She could see the boy she once knew buried under years of hardship. She wondered what had happened to him. How had the kid who wanted to help others ended up on the wrong side of the law? When it came time for Tony to enter his plea, he finally looked up at the judge's bench. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Rachel saw a flicker of recognition cross his face. His mouth opened slightly as if he was about to say something, but then he quickly looked down again. "How do you plead?" Rachel asked, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Tony replied quietly. The formal words felt strange coming from someone who used to call her Ray Ray when they were kids. Rachel had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from showing any emotion. The attorney representing Tony was a young public defender who looked like he had just graduated from law school. He seemed overwhelmed and unprepared. Rachel could tell from his fumbling with papers that this case wasn't getting the attention it deserved. In a three-strikes case, the difference between a good lawyer and a bad one could literally mean the difference between freedom and life in prison. As the proceedings continued, Rachel found it impossible to concentrate on the legal details. Instead, her mind kept wandering back to memories of Tony. She remembered the time he had stood up to bullies who were picking on a younger kid at school. She remembered how he had stayed after school to help her with math when she was struggling. She remembered the way his face would light up when he talked about his dreams for the future. The hearing was brief, just a formal reading of charges and setting of a trial date. But for Rachel, it felt like hours. When the bailiff led Tony away, he glanced back at her one more time. This time, she was sure he knew exactly who she was. After the courtroom emptied, Rachel sat alone at the judge's bench, staring at Tony's case file. According to the documents, he had 2 previous convictions for drug-related offenses. The first was possession with intent to distribute, and the second was theft to support a drug habit. Now this armed robbery charge would be his 3rd strike. Rachel knew the law. 3rd strike meant mandatory life sentence. There was no room for judicial discretion in these cases. The law was designed to keep repeat offenders off the streets permanently. But as she looked at Tony's name on the file, all she could think about was the boy who had shared his lunch with her and dreamed of becoming a teacher. She realized she was facing an impossible situation. Ethically, she should probably recuse herself from the case due to their personal history. Any judge would understand that conflict of interest. But something deep inside her rebelled against that idea. If she recused herself, Tony would get another judge who didn't know his story, who didn't know the good person he had once been. Rachel closed the file and walked back to her chambers, her mind spinning with questions that had no easy answers. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her bed, replaying the moment when she had recognized Tony in her courtroom. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, not the weathered, defeated man from today, but the bright-eyed teenager who had walked beside her to school every morning. She got up at 3 in the morning and made herself a cup of tea. Standing in her kitchen, looking out at the city lights, she thought about the path that had brought her to this moment. After college and law school, she had worked as a prosecutor for 10 years before being appointed to the bench. She had always prided herself on being fair but firm, following the law without letting personal feelings interfere with justice. But this was different. This wasn't just any defendant, this was Tony. The next morning, Rachel arrived at the courthouse early. She needed to make a decision about whether to recuse herself from Tony's case. She pulled out the ethics guidelines and read through them carefully. The rules were clear. Judges should step aside when they have a personal relationship with a defendant that might affect their ability to be impartial. By any reasonable standard, she should recuse herself. She and Tony had been close friends for years. They had shared secrets, dreams, and countless conversations about their futures. No one would question her decision to step aside. But as Rachel sat in her chambers, she couldn't stop thinking about what would happen if she did recuse herself. Tony's case would be assigned to another judge at random. It could be Judge Williams, who was known for always giving the maximum sentence, or Judge Thompson, who had once said in a newspaper interview that repeat offenders deserved no sympathy from the courts. Rachel knew that any other judge would look at Tony's file and see exactly what the law intended them to see: a 3-time felon who deserved to be locked away for life. They wouldn't see the boy who had given up his college dreams to take care of his sick mother. They wouldn't know about his kind heart or his desire to help others. She spent the morning researching Tony's case more thoroughly. The police report painted a clear picture of what had happened. Tony had entered a convenience store at night, approached the counter and demanded money while keeping one hand in his jacket pocket, implying he had a weapon. The clerk, fearing for his safety, had given him the cash from the register. Tony had fled but was caught 3 blocks away with the stolen money. What struck Rachel was that no weapon was ever found. Tony had made the clerk believe he was armed, but he wasn't actually carrying anything dangerous. It was still armed robbery under the law, but it suggested that Tony wasn't a violent person, just someone desperate enough to make a very bad decision. She also discovered something that made her heart ache. The robbery had occurred just 2 days after Tony's mother had been evicted from her apartment. According to the police report, Tony had told the arresting officers that he needed money to help his mother find a place to stay. Rachel remembered Tony's mother, Mrs. Rivera. She had been like a second mother to Rachel when they were kids. Mrs. Rivera worked 2 jobs to support her family and somehow always had a plate of food ready for Rachel when she came over after school. The thought of this kind woman being homeless while her son sat in jail was almost unbearable. As the morning wore on, Rachel found herself thinking about the purpose of the criminal justice system. Was it simply to punish people who broke the law? Or was it supposed to serve a greater purpose, to protect society while giving offenders a chance to change their lives? The 3 strikes law was designed with good intentions. The idea was to keep dangerous, repeat offenders off the streets. But looking at Tony's case, Rachel wondered if the law was being applied too broadly. Tony's previous convictions were both drug-related, crimes that hurt him more than anyone else. And this robbery, while serious, seemed more like an act of desperation than violence. Rachel thought about all the cases she had seen over the years. She had sentenced young men who reminded her of Tony to long prison terms, always telling herself that she was just following the law. But how many of those men might have turned their lives around if given a different chance? Around noon, Rachel's assistant knocked on her door. "Judge Martinez, you have a visitor. Tony Rivera's mother is here. She says she needs to speak with you about her son's case." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She knew she shouldn't meet with Mrs. Rivera. It would be highly unusual for a judge to speak privately with a defendant's family member. But before she could stop herself, she heard herself saying, "Send her in." Mrs. Rivera looked much older than Rachel remembered, but her eyes were still kind and gentle. She was small and frail, wearing a worn coat that had seen better days. When she saw Rachel, tears immediately filled her eyes. "Rachel, is that really you?" Mrs. Rivera asked in Spanish-accented English. "Yes, Mrs. Rivera, it's me." The older woman began to cry. "I can't believe it. Little Rachel all grown up and a judge. I'm so proud of you, mija." Rachel felt her own eyes filling with tears. "Mrs. Rivera, I shouldn't be talking to you about Tony's case. It's not proper. Please just listen," Mrs. Rivera pleaded. "I know my Tony has made mistakes. Big mistakes. But he's not a bad person." "You know him, Rachel." "You know his heart." Mrs. Rivera told Rachel about the years after high school, how Tony had dropped out of college to take care of her when she got diabetes and lost her job, how he had worked 3 jobs to pay for her medical bills, how he had struggled with depression and eventually turned to drugs to cope with the stress. "He tried so hard to stay clean," Mrs. Rivera said. "He went to programs, went to church, tried to get his life back together. But it's hard, you know? When you grow up poor and then you get sick and lose everything, it's hard to see hope." She explained that Tony's latest troubles had started when she lost her apartment. "I felt so guilty. My son committed this crime because of me, because I needed help and he didn't know where else to turn." Rachel listened, her heart breaking with every word. She thought about the promise she and Tony had made on her front porch all those years ago, that they would both make it out of their neighborhood and do something meaningful with their lives. She had kept that promise. Tony had tried, but life had knocked him down over and over again. After Mrs. Rivera left, Rachel sat alone in her chambers, facing the most difficult decision of her career. She could recuse herself from the case and let another judge handle it. That was the safe choice, the ethical choice, according to the rulebook. Tony would likely get life in prison, but at least she wouldn't have to be the one to sentence him, or she could find another way. Rachel spent the afternoon researching alternative sentencing options. She looked into rehabilitation programs, work release programs, and other creative solutions that might help Tony while still serving the interests of justice. What she found surprised her. There was a relatively new program in the county that focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment for nonviolent offenders. Participants lived in a halfway house, worked at community service jobs, and received counseling and job training. The program had a remarkably high success rate. Over 80% of participants stayed out of trouble after completing it. The catch was that the program was only available to first-time offenders or those with minor records. Tony's 3 strikes made him ineligible under the normal guidelines. But Rachel discovered something interesting in the legal code. Judges had discretionary power to recommend alternative sentencing in cases where they believed traditional punishment wouldn't serve the interests of justice. It was rarely used and it would be controversial, but it was legally possible. As the sun set outside her office window, Rachel made her decision. She wasn't going to recuse herself from Tony's case. Instead, she was going to do something that would shock everyone involved. She was going to offer Tony a choice that could change both of their lives forever. The boy who had once shared his lunch with her deserved a chance to share something else, a chance at redemption. 2 years later, Rachel stood at the podium in the community center, where Tony had spent countless hours serving meals and offering hope to people who had lost everything. Today was different, though. Today she wasn't here as a judge, but as a guest speaker at the graduation ceremony for the 50th person to complete the rehabilitation program that had saved Tony's life. The audience was filled with an unusual mix of people. Former homeless individuals sat next to social workers. Ex-convicts who had turned their lives around chatted with prosecutors and defense attorneys. Community leaders shared seats with people who were still working their way through various recovery programs. At the front of the room, wearing a simple black suit that he had saved months to buy, stood Tony Rivera. But he wasn't the same broken man who had shuffled into Rachel's courtroom in handcuffs 2 years earlier. This Tony stood tall and confident, his eyes bright with purpose and hope. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. After completing his 2-year program, Tony had been offered a full-time position at the community center. What started as community service had become his calling. He had enrolled in night classes at the community college, working toward the teaching degree he had abandoned decades earlier. But Tony's real education had come from working with people society had written off. He had learned that addiction, homelessness, and crime were often symptoms of deeper problems: poverty, trauma, mental illness, and a lack of opportunity. He had discovered that treating these root causes was far more effective than simply punishing the symptoms. Rachel watched as Tony stepped up to the microphone to address the graduates and their families. When he began to speak, his voice was steady and strong. 5 years ago, I was sitting in a jail cell facing the possibility of spending the rest of my life in prison, Tony said. I had lost hope in myself and in the possibility that things could ever get better. I thought my story was over. He looked directly at Rachel as he continued. But sometimes, if we're very lucky, someone sees something in us that we can't see in ourselves. Someone takes a risk on us when we haven't earned it, when we don't deserve it, and when everyone else thinks they're crazy for trying. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. The person who took that risk on me was sitting in this room. Judge Rachel Martinez could have followed the rules, played it safe, and sent me away forever. Instead, she chose to believe that people can change, that redemption is possible, and that sometimes the justice system needs to be about healing rather than punishment. Tony went on to talk about his journey through the program, his struggles with addiction, and his work with the homeless community. But what struck Rachel most was how he talked about the future. Not just his own future, but the future of criminal justice reform. We've proven something important here, Tony said. We've shown that when you give people the tools they need and the support they deserve, they can rebuild their lives. They can become productive members of society. They can even become leaders in their communities. The statistics backed up Tony's claims. The rehabilitation program now had a success rate of over 80%. Participants were far less likely to reoffend than those who went through the traditional prison system. The program had expanded to serve hundreds of people, and similar programs were being established in other counties across the state. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real impact could be seen in the faces of the people in the audience. Former addicts who were now counselors, ex-convicts who had become community advocates, and homeless individuals who were now helping others find housing and hope. After the ceremony, Rachel and Tony walked together through the neighborhood where they had grown up. Many of the old houses had been renovated, and new businesses had opened along the main street. The community center where Tony now worked had become a hub of activity, offering services ranging from job training to addiction counseling to childcare for working parents. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had made different choices that day in your chambers? Tony asked as they paused in front of Rachel's childhood home. Rachel considered the question. I think about it sometimes, but I don't regret the choice we made. Yes, it was risky. Yes, it caused problems for both of us, but look what came out of it. The problems had been real. Rachel had faced months of investigation by the Judicial Review Board. She had endured harsh criticism from colleagues and the media. For a while, it looked like her career might be over. But the success of Tony's case had changed everything. The Judicial Review Board ultimately concluded that while Rachel's methods were unconventional, they were legally sound and had produced extraordinary results. Instead of being censured, she had been asked to help develop new guidelines for alternative sentencing. Law schools began inviting Rachel to speak about her approach to criminal justice. She had been profiled in legal journals and had become a voice for reform within the judicial system. Most importantly, other judges had begun following her example, looking for ways to address the root causes of crime rather than simply punishing its symptoms. "You know what I think about most?" Tony said as they continued walking. "I think about all the people who didn't get the chance I got. All the kids from neighborhoods like this who made mistakes and never found their way back." This was why Tony had become so passionate about education and prevention. He regularly spoke at schools in low-income areas, sharing his story and encouraging young people to make better choices than he had. He had helped establish mentorship programs that paired at-risk youth with adults who had overcome similar challenges. "That's the next step," Rachel said. "We've proven that rehabilitation works for people who have already fallen through the cracks. Now we need to focus on catching people before they fall." They had been working together on a proposal for a new program that would identify young people who were at high risk for criminal behavior and provide them with the support and opportunities they needed to stay on the right path. The program would offer tutoring, job training, mental health services, and mentorship, all the things that might have kept Tony from making his first mistake. As they reached the corner where Tony used to wait for Rachel every morning before school, they stopped and looked at each other. The years had changed them both, but the friendship that had sustained them as children had grown stronger through their shared experience of taking a chance on redemption. "Do you remember what we promised each other on your front porch?" Rachel asked. "That we'd both make it out of this neighborhood and do something meaningful with our lives," Tony replied. "I think we kept that promise, don't you?" Tony smiled, the same bright smile she remembered from their childhood. "Yeah, I think we did. Just not in the way we expected." 3 months later, Rachel received a letter that made her cry. It was from a young woman named Lisa Chen, who had been one of the first people Tony had helped at the homeless shelter. Lisa had completed drug treatment, found stable housing, and was now enrolled in nursing school. "I wanted you to know that the decision you made to give Tony a second chance didn't just save his life," Lisa wrote. "It saved mine too, and probably dozens of others. Tony showed me that it was possible to change, even when everyone else had given up on me. He believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself." The letter went on to describe how Lisa was now volunteering at the same shelter where she had once been a client, helping other women escape addiction and homelessness. She was planning to specialize in addiction medicine after graduating from nursing school. "I know people criticized you for what you did," Lisa continued. "They said you were showing favoritism or breaking the rules. But what you really did was show that justice doesn't have to be about punishment. It can be about healing and hope and giving people the chance to become who they're meant to be." Rachel kept that letter in her desk drawer, next to the reports and statistics that documented the success of the rehabilitation program. But it wasn't the numbers that mattered most to her. It was the knowledge that she and Tony had started something that was bigger than both of them. Their story had become a symbol of what was possible when the criminal justice system focused on transformation rather than retribution. It had inspired changes in laws, policies, and attitudes about crime and punishment. Most importantly, it had given hope to countless people who had lost faith in the possibility of redemption. Years later, when Rachel was asked to give the keynote address at a national conference on criminal justice reform, she would think back to that moment in her courtroom, when she first recognized her childhood friend. She would remember the choice she faced and the decision that changed everything. "The question isn't whether people can change," she would tell the audience of judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and advocates. "The question is whether we're brave enough to give them the chance to prove it." And in the audience, wearing his graduate school cap and gown, he had finally completed his teaching degree, Tony Rivera, would smile and remember a promise made on a front porch by two kids who believed that where you came from didn't have to determine where you ended up. They were right.